Welcome to Living Mirrors with Dr. James Cook. My guest this week is W. Keith Campbell. Keith is a social psychologist and a leading expert on narcissism. He's a professor at the University of Georgia and has written several books on narcissism, including The Narcissism Epidemic and most recently The New Science of Narcissism. Today we talk about the psychology of personality in general and the modern scientific understanding of narcissism both as a personality trait and as a personality disorder. Hope you enjoyed the conversation. Okay, I'm here with Keith Campbell. Keith, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Oh, thanks for having me, James.
So let's start off with kind of how you came to study narcissism, because I understand your initial interest were in kind of the more spiritual side of things to do with the self, being an illusion. Is that right?
Yeah, it's interesting you heard that, because I've talked to people about that. But when I started in grad school and studying the self, and I wanted to study, the Buddhist self, non-attachment, and anybody who's in the area of self-research, which goes back to William James, I'm being a little technical with your show, I hope it's okay, but anybody in this area ends up studying Buddhism because the Buddhists were the ones thinking about the self longer than anyone. They have the best philosophy of the self. So I was interested in that, but I couldn't figure out how to study it. People since then have done a very good job looking at some of these issues psychologically. I couldn't do it. But if you turned around and looked at narcissism, you kind of see the ego just going for it. You see how the ego's formed, you see how it's sort of becomes rewarded, how it can grow, how it can crumble. It's just like a very big way to study. In the same way, I think when the early neuroscientists started studying nerves, they would look at like a squid or an eel. There's a squid nerve that was very big. Is that right?
Yeah, I remember the giant squid neuron. And when I was an undergrad, they were at pains to clarify that was a giant neuron from a squid, not a neuron from a giant squid. That they weren't going and wrangling these giant squids.
Yeah. So, but the idea. So when Freud started studying neuroscience, he started studying because it was the easiest one to see. And I think for me, looking at narcissism, it's a very easy way to see the ego in action. But it's not the only way your ego can capture you, and people's egos can control, people can be really communal and loving and spiritual and become very ego focused too. But that's part of the reason, was just to understand the ego from this other perspective.
Right. And it might be worth starting off with a bit of background as to, what exactly narcissism is as a concept in the kind of psychology.
Yeah, so the term is used, I found out, and usually people are using the term day to day as sort of a pejorative word. And sometimes people mean it clinically and sometimes they don't, and they mix it up. So I'm going to try to give you the psychology definitions. There's really 2 or 3 definitions we talk about. The first is when we're talking about narcissism, we're typically talking about a personality trait. And as a trait, it's something that people range on from sort of a high end to a low end. Most people are around the middle, just like something like extroversion or self-esteem or creativity. It's a normal distribution for the most part. And like any trait, there's benefits and costs. Narcissism has good things and bad things to it. In terms of the definition of narcissism, this is where it gets confusing. When we talk about narcissism, you have this sort of sense of superiority that when people think about, you have a positive view of yourself, you're superior to other people with a sense of entitlement and a desire for admiration or positive feedback. So that's the very basic idea. You think you're better than other people, you have a sense of entitlement, maybe lack some empathy, like to get positive feedback from the environment. That's kind of your core definition. But the way that worked out in the field was people ended up, I can go into the history of this, but we ended up talking about 2 different people with the label narcissist. One group of people were sort of entitled, a little bit callous, but were also extroverted, charming, energized, expressive, maybe authoritarian sometimes. And these folks would end up being leaders or bad dating partners or bad bosses because they were often very attractive, energetic people that would be mean later on. The other form of narcissism was this more vulnerable form, which are people had this sort of same sense of self-superiority, but they didn't have the gumption, the extroversion, the drive to engage with the world. So they became depressed and a little bit unstable and uncertain about themselves, and often have more narcissistic fantasies. So that's this more vulnerable narcissism, sometimes called covert or hidden or basement or shy narcissism, is kind of the more fragile side. And the challenge was when the clinical folks, the clinical therapists or psychotherapists would see narcissists, they're often seeing the more vulnerable forms because they're the ones who are like, I'm depressed, I need help. The grandiose forms are running the world, and they're not going into therapy because they're doing pretty well. They do get in therapy sometimes, but generally not. And so what happened was over time, clinicians started to think, well, all these narcissists deep down must be kind of wounded and vulnerable, or else they wouldn't want to take over the world. Because only person who'd want to take over the world and be that famous and have all those girlfriends was somebody who's really wounded inside. That's not really the case. Turns out there's two different forms. There's this more vulnerable people, there's the more grandiose people. Some are a little bit of both, but they're very different. They have different backgrounds, different childhoods. Then to make it a little more confusing is there's this clinical term, which is narcissistic personality disorder. That is a personality disorder which is clinically diagnosed from extreme narcissism. So you have very extreme narcissism, primarily grandiose, but also some vulnerability. And to make it a disorder, it has to lead to impairment. So if it's not impairing your life in some way, it can't be diagnosed. The impairment might be, with narcissism, it's often, with impairment, we often talk about love and work. With narcissism, what it seems to do is it damages relationships. It can be very toxic, because you're using people as props for your own glory, and people don't like that, and you can be destructive. And it also can ruin your work because you can't work with people, or you take too many risks, or you do other bad things. So it can be really destructive at that point. But when we're talking about a disorder, we're talking about maybe 1 or 2% of the people. So if you say, Keith, somebody says, Keith, you're such a narcissist. I'm like, what do you mean? Do you mean I'm kind of vulnerable and a little shy and I'm playing video games? Or do you mean I'm kind of an arrogant jerk and, you shouldn't work with me? Or you're saying I've got a clinical disorder and I need to go into therapy and I'm really, really pathological? And it could be any of those things. It's just confusing.
Right. And I think it makes me think of the fact that a lot of conversations around narcissism understandably happen from the extreme side of, people encountering people with disorders who are extremely toxic and pathological. So it's worth probably saying up front, acknowledging the harm that's done there, because a lot of what we're talking about is the science behind it, a kind of, conversation about it as a trait and that kind of thing. And you mentioned kind of positive as well as negatives. So it's worth, I think, just acknowledging that this is going to be a slightly different kind of conversation, I think, to those kinds of ones.
Right. Because if you look at the interest in narcissism often comes from people who have been victimized, which happens all the time. I mean, I get emails constantly from people with a damaged relationship from somebody who's narcissistic. When people who are been victimized by narcissism come up with a model of narcissists, it's a very negative and destructive and toxic model, because that's what they've experienced of it. They get that one face of it, but they're not seeing the face, like they're not seeing the trade-offs that person deals with because they're coming out clinically. So when I talk about it from the research, I'm always trying to stay balanced and think about these things as trade-offs, or else I start, I'm trying to be a little bit scientific is what I'm saying, James, right, without getting too caught up in this stuff and being too judgmental. And these things, if these things exist, they have benefits and costs, and we need to understand those, I think.
Right. And I think that's really, really important because, for me, my interest, like a lot of people in this area, comes from having, been wounded in many ways by a kind of family dynamic that was governed by narcissism. And it's kind of interesting to kind of try to, because that's such an emotionally charged thing, it's interesting to try to kind of engage with it as this like neutral thing. And for me, you mentioned, people build up their own models of it. I have this strong intuition. You mentioned this kind of the idea that you have the vulnerable narcissists and you also have the grandiose ones, but maybe deep down they're vulnerable. For me, and you mentioned, I think in your book, you call this the mask model of narcissism. And that's something that always resonated with me. The relevant axis seemed to be, as far as I could understand it, maybe a subtle form of vulnerability where it's like, fundamentally, are you the kind of person who thinks you can go out in the world, trust people, be a bit, actually be okay with being vulnerable, and like collaborate with people? Or do you think, no way am I going to risk that? I'm going to engage in manipulation and, So there's a kind of subtle form of vulnerability that I felt for me allowed me to make sense of it as a disorder. But I guess that could occur in some cases and not in other cases, maybe.
Well, you can certainly have people that have aspects of really just straight up grandiosity and vulnerability. And so my guess is what's happening here is that you find people that are kind of raised, that are more of these grandiose forms, but they get some trauma early on or some of this vulnerability, and then they end up with these defensive structures. You can imagine how somebody can end up with these more psychodynamic structures, being traumatized, but still having the grandiosity. 80% of the time you seem like a really likable, grandiose person, but when you get under stress, you become really mean and, defense. I mean, yes, I can very easily characterize somebody like that. But when you look at the big data sets, we're going to see, well, that's really this person with a piece of this mixed in, if that makes it. It's sort of somebody grandiose with some toxicity with it, rather than somebody who's just classically grandiose. But I know what you're talking about.
Yeah. And so you were talking about this kind of as, if we go back from the disorder side of things to the personality trait side of things, in order to understand it, it's good to see, where it manifests in all of us, I guess, as well. And so maybe we could talk about what is the difference between a personality trait and a disorder, and how personality kind of traits, how they're mapped really in psychology.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a lot to go there. My general approach to personality is that people's personality is, there's these kind of averages we have, but what's really important is to be flexible in our personality. So with something like being grandiose, if I'm on stage in front of like 100 people and I'm a big expressive personality, it's great. I get a lot of positive feedback. That's great. But if I hold that with me and go on my next interaction where I'm with two people in a room and I'm like big personality and I'm waiting for that adulation, I'm not getting it. I have to be able to turn my personality on, and I have to dial it back. And then when I'm in another relationship and I have to be a caregiver, I have to be able to change face and go, look, this isn't about me, Keith. I got to help this person. So in life, we're often turning our personality on and off. When your personality gets rigid and extreme, inflexible, that's where it gets dangerous, because you're not really able to shift across situations. So one of the things that can become disordered with personality is when it's inflexible. You just can't move it. Second is extreme. So if you're extreme and inflexible, it's just going to make you hard to navigate through life, unless you really structure your life. Like if you're really narcissistic and you're an emperor and you just have the yes people and you behead people you don't like. I mean, you can build a life that you can allow a lot of narcissism, but generally it's hard because the world doesn't let you be who you want. So having a personality that's extreme and inflexible can lead to problems. And then if you have those problems, it can be diagnosed as a disorder. So extreme, inflexible, and then the usual things with personality disorders, they have to exist since childhood, they have to be over time. So if you were just a normal dude and all of a sudden you just got a huge head and for like a week you became a narcissistic maniac, my first thought would be, did James get into the cocaine? Or is James having a bipolar episode? If it's something that just happens quickly, you wouldn't look for personality. The idea of personality, it's something in your character, it's something that's been there your whole life, that's maybe become magnified into a disorder, and then maybe it will go down and be less of a disorder and be just kind of a personality. Maybe you've just got extreme personality, but it's not really disorder. So that's the idea. And I can keep going. So tell me where you want me to go with this. This get really big.
Yeah, I mean, I want to seize on that inflexibility point because it's interesting as well. You mentioned that kind of cocaine can push people in the direction of kind of the grandiose narcissistic dynamic, and that strongly suggests there's a very kind of perhaps quite straightforward neurobiological aspect to it. But then also on the psychological side, I tend to see, if I think about what the ego is and what personality is, just from through my own lens of how I think about life and the mind. I kind of see it as a coping mechanism, even in the healthiest of us. It's a way to kind of get through life and And so the inflexibility to me feels like, if you bring in the trauma piece, that in some cases you could have someone who's basically, they've got their coping mechanism and they're sticking to it as hard as they can, because of some fear, some trauma in the past. Yeah.
And that makes sense to me. And so that trauma seems to keep people stuck a little bit.
Right.
And so they can't really adapt. The reason I don't talk about trauma a lot with narcissism, it's not specific. I mean, trauma leads to pathology across the board. It's not specific to narcissism. So as an academic, I was never like, well, let's figure out the trauma because that's the key. It's just that seems to be an overall problem across personality disorders.
Right.
But the more I've talked to people about it, like talking to you and talking to all these people about narcissism, it seems that in real life, lots of these problems are the combination of narcissism with some trauma that's leading these people to become rigid and inflexible and becoming a bit of petty tyrants and hurting people. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned sort of in the book that there are multiple different models people have suggested, whether it's evolutionarily, whether it's kind of, genetic, and I think something that's fascinating about this, as just a kind of a way into thinking about the mind is that it is a cocktail. It's a mix of all these different things, right? There's a bit of evolutionary component, but then, and maybe the reason, some of us seize on the trauma component is because we're like, well, if we can avoid that childhood trauma in the next generation, maybe people might still be a bit grandiose, a bit narcissistic in terms of their trait, but maybe we can get rid of the inflexibility or soften that a bit.
Yeah, and I definitely agree with that because trauma, I think, is an issue. I tend to be very when I think about things, I just grab all the maps I have. So I've got my evolutionary map that's pretty good. And I've got my, big 5 personality map, which I really have a good one. And I have my, basic biology map, which is terrible. And my self map, which is William James map, which is really good. And I just use them all. But when you think about something like narcissism, you can think about it at all levels. So you can think about it from very basic kind of biological drive. So approach orientation is something we might call about it. And might be like a dopamine reward system, maybe in the more biological neuroscience side of it, but really reward system. And that reward system, when it filters through the self, you kind of filter it up through the self, it becomes self-enhancement. So the reward is, I'm the best. I'm going to get rewards by getting positive feedback. So basic reward, when it gets into the self or the ego, becomes self-enhancement or self-adulation, self-expansion. And then so narcissism kind of maybe is at this more extreme personality end, but at the very basic level, it's about reward seeking, getting goals, and then associating those goals with the ego. And I mean, that's how I'd play it out if I used all those things.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned the big 5 personality traits. Let's go into that next and maybe just go over what they are. And
Sure. This is such an interesting basic model that we use for personality. And it turns out when you start looking at personality traits, and this was first done by Galton in Britain back in the day, trying to understand heredity of twins. So people said, we got to understand personality traits. We need a good model. Well, where would they be? Where do we find these traits? And people discovered, this is Galton's idea, that it's in language. If we have a trait to describe somebody like he's narcissistic or arrogant or smarmy or clever or nice or mean or whatever they are, we're going to have a word for it, a single word if it's something that's important. And so people started looking for those traits and putting them into these chunks or bins. You imagine just binning all these traits. So nice and kind and compassionate and loving and all those will be in one bin, and creative and wacky and zany and weird will be in another bin, and we'll just bin them up. And when people did this over the years, we've come up with a model that's five bins, works pretty well. It's not magic. You can do 4, 3, 2, 1, 6, 7, 8, but 5 is a really good one. And we call those the big 5 because they're big, because they're big bins, not because they're anything big about the traits, they're just big bins. Those big 5 traits cover a large part of any personality you're going to see. I think about them as basic ingredients of any personality, any sort of specific trait you can find, you can go in those bins and find the ingredients of it. The big 5, the easiest way to remember them is they spell ocean or canoe, even though the way the psychologists usually do it is NEOAC. And to go through ocean and describe what they are, the first of these big five is openness to experience or intellectance. This has to do with sort of liking ideas or intellectance or philosophy. So your show is just very high openness, just weird ideas. Conscientiousness is more like work ethic, dutifulness, discipline. The term grit, when you hear about grit, that's really an aspect of conscientiousness. And conscientiousness is what you see in the workplace. So if you're looking for good workers, you want people really conscientious. E is for extroversion. And when we talk about extroversion, we're talking about it to mean sociability. But in psychology, extroversion also includes drive or maybe ambition, energy. So there's something in there with ambition as well as just sociability. A is for agreeableness. That basically means being nice. So agreeableness has to do with kind of working with people and being compassionate. Those are the two aspects. And then, where am I? Agreeableness, and N is neuroticism. So neuroticism is the term, we use the old Freudian term, but we use this to describe this combination of anxiety, depression, and hostility. And neuroticism is what you see with most of the clinical disorders, the psychological disorders. The core construct of those is neuroticism. They have other pieces as well. So those big five traits can be used like ingredients to make anything. To make narcissism, you take this low agreeableness, antagonism, which is the opposite of agreeable. So you take somebody who's mean, low in agreeableness, and you add a bunch of this extroversion, especially drive. That's grandiose narcissism. Take somebody who's mean, and you add some neuroticism to it. So somebody's mean and they're insecure. You get more vulnerable narcissism. Does that make sense? So you can kind of use these big five traits to make any trait you want. And in the field, for us, it works a lot like a Rosetta Stone. So you're like, dude, I've got this new trait we're working on in the lab. It's this. I go, well, what's the big five profile of that trait? I go, okay, I know what your trait is. So it's a language we can use to put every trait into so we can talk to each other.
Right. I think it's worth just focusing on a bit of the detail of how these traits were kind of come up with, because I think it's really elegant. You mentioned kind of putting them into bins, but this is done kind of mathematically, right, by getting people to kind of take surveys, and I think, yeah, as you kind of mentioned, it's maybe rare or impossible to hear someone say, oh, my friend is like the nicest person I've ever met, but they're also the least kind person I've ever met. Like, that just doesn't happen. Like, we understand that there's a huge correlation there, and you can extract those correlations, right?
Right, exactly. So the way it was done mathematically was they started looking at correlations. That was the first, correlations that how these things sort of hang together, go together across people. Then they developed what was called factor analysis. This is what Thurstone did up at Chapel Hill, UNC. And what factor analysis allowed you to do is take these big patterns of correlation. So I've got 100 traits correlated with 100 traits, meaning, I don't know how much to go into this, but imagine I gave 1,000 people 100 traits each and said, rate yourself on these traits. And then I saw how much each of those ratings correlated with each other. So with a factor analysis, I can say, well, it looks like I have 100 traits, but when I look in and see if those traits hang together themselves, really it turns out to be 5 traits under there. And that's what factor analysis does. It allows you to extract the underlying factors. So that was one thing. And now we're using more network analysis and other things to try to get, and now, some more complex systems. There's stuff they're doing now is really cool and a little over my head. But a lot of this comes from factor analysis.
Right. And you mentioned that, the fact there's 5, but you could have fewer or more, right? And I think you can imagine that there's a trade-off, right? You could either say, well, I'm going to have 2 factors. I'm going to say, are you nice or are you nasty? Or I could say, well, I'm going to be a poet and have 2,000 factors and know all the nuances, right? And 5 seems to be a kind of good compromise.
Yes. The big 2 model, which I use a lot, and the big 2 look a lot like yin and yang. So there's one factor which has to do with agency, shaping the world, breaking the world, making things, building. It's a combination of extroversion and openness. It's sort of dopaminergic. And there's another factor which has to do, and sometimes we call that plasticity because it has to do with change. And there's another factor which is called stability. yin, whatever you want to call it. But it has to do with stabilizing things, have to do with being nice and calm and conscientious. And so those big two traits work really well for a lot of systems. Like when I study social media, I'm like, well, there's people on there that are kind of breaking stuff and adding stuff, and there are people that are trying to make it all work together. So the big two is really useful for that. I know work in Asia, Far East, people really got into a big six factor because they said, well, it's this breaking down agreeableness in Asia to bring out honesty, humility factor. This sort of humility piece is really important. So maybe if we're in Asia, we should use that model more. So people will modify it depending on the situation they're in. But that 5 is really seems to be the sweet spot for, that seems to be a good set point for everything.
Right. And so to go back to the traits, the kind of ingredients for narcissism, you were talking about this kind of self-importance, antagonism, and neuroticism. And is the kind of antagonism, not wanting to collaborate with others or being kind of hostile? Is that like something that's really crucial to it?
It's the antagonism piece can come out in a couple ways, but with narcissism, with grandiose, what I see is that as long as your interests and the interests of the narcissist are aligned, it's great. But as soon as you think about like a little bit of game theory, or as soon as your interests are not aligned, it's the narcissist versus you, the narcissist will pick the narcissist over you. So that's where you see the piece. If everything's in the same direction, you start dating somebody, you want the same things, it's great. You start working for somebody, same things, great. You're watching somebody perform, you want to watch them perform, and they want to perform, great. But as soon as you're at loggerheads with each other's goals, that's where that selfishness comes in with grandiosity. With vulnerability, sometimes you see hostility, which comes out of neuroticism. I'm getting a little technical here, but in this neuroticism piece, there's this angry hostility where people are they're in pain and they can just be mean out of pain. So sometimes you see people who are suffering and they're just kind of mean, but they're mean, this is weird, but they're mean out of the suffering, not because they're naturally mean people. If they weren't suffering, they wouldn't naturally be mean, if that makes sense. So you see it in a couple ways, but yeah, the antagonism is really another way to think about it. If you take grandiose narcissism and you get rid of antagonism, all you have is really boldness. We call that in the field fearless dominance sometimes. If you think about Chuck Yeager, the test pilot who just passed away, when he died, the personality people like, there's a great exemplar of fearless dominance. So that's something that has pieces of narcissism. But if you have somebody who's not antagonistic, but still driven and really self-focused, they can be really likable people. They're just bold risk takers that we kind of look up to, but they're not mean, so we don't dislike them. So that meanness piece, if you get rid of that, you can be a pretty decent person.
And then if you couple the antagonism with the self-importance, I think lack of empathy feels like maybe a way to understand it as well.
Yeah, the empathy. Empathy's in there a lot. I mean, empathy is that piece of agreeableness that the challenge with narcissism, and we've done a lot of research, some great people in England doing this, it's not me, but they've looked at trying to break down empathy. So there's this idea that you can think of empathy as cognitive or emotional. So one is, do I feel what people are feeling, sort of a sympathy, and one is, can I perspective take? Can I say, yeah, I know what Keith's feeling, I know he's suffering, I know why. It seems that people are narcissistic, can perspective take just fine. There's not like some inability to see other people's perspective. The challenge is that emotional part. And the challenge is that it's not necessarily there, but there's not the motivation for it. So they might have the capacity for empathy, but it's not as important. So you're like, why don't you care? Well, I would care, but it just didn't make my list. Right. If that makes sense. So it's people like originally thought people that are narcissists, they had no capacity for seeing what people think, but they seem to. It just seems to be not as important relatively.
Right. And if we link this back to the more kind of philosophical way of thinking about the self, like they're when people kind of, have these kind of spiritual states, they can have the experience of looking at another person and basically feeling like you're me, or like we're all the same thing, like a deep kind of connection of your sense of self expanding to everything. So it feels like there's a kind of continuum here from being like, I am really what's important versus we're all in this together and we're all equally important.
And so when you start getting to those issues of connection and altruism and reaching beyond the self to the other, I mean, even in the social psych literature, you start going to those more Eastern ideas that maybe we're both the same. So it's, you know this stuff and I don't, so please jump in and correct me at any time. But I think Schopenhauer once described it like we think all these people are separate, but they're like characters in the same dream. So it's like there's one dreamer with these different characters. And when you have that breakthrough, like looking at an aspen grove, like in the US, we have these aspen groves that look like they're all these trees, but they really are one tree underneath because they run off runners. When you see the world that way and you start realizing that myself includes yourself, being selfish for me, I have to be selfish for you too, that has to break down the narcissistic, it has to break down the whole process in a way if your self expands to something else. We've tried to do this in the lab a little bit, but theoretically it should work. I don't know. This stuff gets really hard because I'm sorry, I've got too many things. So like one psychologist, Art Aaron, really got into this from a yogic perspective. So he got into this idea of self-expansion, which is, I fall in love with somebody, but it's really my Atman's connecting to their self. And so I'm expanding when I connect with them. And he really came at it from this perspective. The problem is when you start taking that, you start looking at narcissism and spiritual traditions, you see a lot of ego inflation. So the recent research that just come out, Roos Vonk just had a paper from the Netherlands on this. I've seen others. But people who can sometimes get into spiritual work, especially energy work, you can become very ego inflated because you're like, I'm a guru, I'm enlightened. So some of this stuff can be really risky for narcissism, even though it seems like it should be a solution to it.
Yeah, I think that's a particular risk with the kind of psychedelic renaissance that we're seeing, because it's such a shortcut to those spiritual states that someone in 20 minutes could have an experience that, and then, a narcissist could basically say, great, I've banked that. Now I can go off and be a guru because I had a glimpse of what it's like to be beyond the ego.
I think that as well. And we've started to look at some psychedelic work with narcissism, and it's really interesting and this is my student Brandon's work, Brandon Weiss, give him credit. I don't want to steal it. We really see the psychedelics, and this is ayahuasca that we've been looking at, really seem to be beneficial for neuroticism, like helping people who are suffering with anxiety or depression or trauma. That seems to be like where the clear benefit is. Narcissism is just not as clear what's going on. Because on one hand, there's this idea that if you have an awe experience, if you have the vision of the Gita, you see that you're this small thing in this infinite universe, your ego is going to get smaller after that and you're going to get more humble. But then you walk out the door of the Maloka and 2 days later, you're telling your bros how you saw God. And they're like, you're cool. And you're like, yeah, because I saw God and you did. And I'm the coolest. So I might be smaller than God, but I'm bigger than all of you little ants. And so it's a risky thing. I don't know, man. I tell everybody, people want gurus. They want gurus. People want someone with the answer. And the problem is it's very easy for people who are narcissistic to jump up and say, yeah, I'll give you the answer. You want the answer? I'll give you the answer. And so in most traditions, there's a mechanism to weed that out. So if you go through academics, you have a mentor and you've got a PhD process, and not that we weed out egomaniacs in academics. Sometimes we encourage it, but at least we know there's a process, a vetting process to get a PhD. If you go into plant medicine and you go work with the Shipibo and you do diets and you practice spend a few years down there, it's like you kind of know what you're doing if you have training. If you go to, you go to India or Tibet back in the day and you do your year in a cave, you've got your training. But nowadays you got somebody that spends like you said, you do a week in a ceremony, you're like, I'm a freaking shaman. And then I'm going to go invade the White House. I'm like, dude, it's not a real shaman. So I get worried with a lot of this stuff. Excited,
Yeah.
but worried.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned, sometimes people want that hierarchy. They want to look up to some guru with the answers. And I think hierarchical organization seems to be something in which narcissists kind of flourish, right? They seem to kind of adopt leadership roles very easily.
Very much. So we when we look at leadership, we break it down into two big areas, which is emerging leadership and effective leadership. And emerging leadership is, how likely are you to rise as a leader in an organization, whether it's a new group in a lab or a company or anything. There's a lot. We've looked at this all sorts of ways. And then effective leadership is, are you a good leader? Narcissism predicts emergent leadership. So people who are narcissistic will become leaders in new groups. They become leaders more quickly in family businesses. They become CEOs more. I mean, they just rise to leadership positions because they like the power. It gives them access to sex and status and things. And a lot of people like, I shouldn't be the leader. I don't know enough. How could I be a guru? But if you got a strong enough ego, you're like, yeah, I should be a guru. So narcissism it just rises to leadership. And when we don't have good mechanisms for leadership selection, that's what you get.
Right. And I think when I first kind of started learning about narcissism, as someone who's coming from the kind of strict science, maybe this would be too much of an overreach from your perspective, but I started to find that I found kind of human history started to make more sense as I understood this psychological trait in terms of this kind of hierarchical thing. And I was thinking that, like, we're, at least in England, we're kind of, taught to see the kind of Roman Empire as this amazing thing and all of these kinds of, things throughout human history. But there's another way of looking at it where for majority of human history, we were living in these kind of decentralized egalitarian groups like hunter-gatherers, and then agriculture comes along and people can start to accumulate wealth and power, and then you get a hierarchy, and then the whole thing takes off. So I start to feel like to me, it makes sense that if the trait of narcissism and the ability to build hierarchies, it kind of co-evolved culturally. Does that sound far out, or does that sound like could be?
No, not in the slightest. My colleague Lenny Martin, who retired, but we used to talk about this a lot. He studied hunter-gatherers, and in a hunter-gatherer group, you go to a small group of hunter-gatherers, and there aren't many left. But if you go, like, you can talk to the Bushmen still, you can go to the Mentawais, talk to the people there. There's still, there's indigenous groups all throughout South America that are larger. But in those small groups, what happens is if you get out of hand, if you become a self-promoter, you start stealing stuff, you start, having sex with people's, wives, whatever partners or whatever you do, they don't want you in the group anymore. So they will kill you. And when you go read the old, the research on hunter-gatherer murders or deaths, what happens if somebody was really a bad guy, they just take you out and they'd have a family member just leave you. So like Lenny would say, yeah, they just have a hunting accident. Oh yeah, Keith, yeah, too bad. He was kind of a jerk. Too bad he got eaten by that tiger. Yeah, bummer. And so it was self-regulating. But what happened is, as soon as people were able to get status, and then I was able to, and so one of the things was resources that you could carry around. So with hunter-gatherers, you don't really have resources to hoard. Once you were able to get resources, like in any sort of agriculture environment, and then you were able to get a group of people to protect you. So as soon as I was able to get a bunch of toadies around, like I'm the arrogant guy, everybody's going to beat me up. But if I get 5 big dudes around me with knives or swords, and I'm like, you can't say anything about me. I got the big guys who are like, yes, sir. And then it's over. Then the power structure goes. The next thing you know, I'm the pharaoh, and you know who I am? I'm just a representation of the sun. You inflate, your ego inflates that much. I'm going to live forever. Build me a pyramid. Can you imagine how the ego inflated from a hunter-gatherer in North Africa to a pharaoh in 500 years? I don't know how long that period was. It's unbelievable. Yeah, that changed the whole thing. You look at all the data. It's like everything's fine, and then just boom.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think, it's kind of, it makes me think as well of, the difference between how you present in the world, the messages you send out, and what's really going on under the surface. And so in a hunter-gatherer community, if you're in a family, like everyone knows each other, you can't really get away with being that deceitful, and that kind of keeps everything in check. But I feel like as you get this kind of stratification, and also just with narcissism where it shows up, there's this distance, there's the mask, the image that's being presented, and then what's going on behind the scenes, which could be manipulation or whatever. And that's why I mentioned the Roman Empire earlier, because I see this like this kind of very successful PR strategy of, as you said, like build these huge things. They looks amazing, but then when you think about the day-to-day life, slavery, all this stuff, the dirty underbelly and the mask are so distant.
Yeah, there was recent research in China looking at urbanization. This is something I figured here, but we don't really have good data from the US, but you see it in China where urbanization is sort of important for narcissism, because if you're in an urban environment, you have to meet more people. You don't have a reputation as clearly, so you can get away with more nonsense, more manipulation. So bigger environments, urban environments, but yeah, a small community, everybody knows who you are. So you're like, yeah, there goes James. He's talking a big game, but we all know James is full of it. Yeah, that's how it is. But you get on social media, no one knows who you are. You get to be anything. It's crazy. So whenever there's a gap between reality and fantasy, when you can kind of sneak ego in, you're going to see ego. And this happens all over the place. I mean, even if you ask people what your GPA is, people will tell you the truth. But if you're like, how are your grades compared to other people? They're like, well, mine are better. So whenever you give people, this is a basic social psych finding, when you give people the space to enhance themselves, they will often do it. Are you a good people person? Oh yeah, I'm a great people person. Well, how do you define people person? Well, I just define it the way that makes me look good. So people will always, not all, but people in general will manipulate the world to make themselves feel good. So when you have a space, but the people in narcissistic do this really well. And when you give them fantasy and social media and big cities, I mean, it's all over.
Yeah, there's an interesting connection here to, so I spoke to Robert Wright, who wrote the book, Why Buddhism is True. And he talks about a kind of idea, kind of cognitive science idea of the self. We feel like we are the self, or the ego, and that it has kind of free will and it runs the show. But there's this, this other way of thinking about it, where it's kind of like a PR agent. It's just a module that basically tells a story about what James is doing. So, if you could stimulate my brain and make me walk out of the room, and you say, why did you walk out of the room? People do, have done these kinds of experiments with split brain patients. And then I would come up with some story, I would confabulate. And, it's kind of pointing to this idea that the ego all along is basically trying to do this task we're talking about that narcissists are doing in the extreme, and kind of just making yourself look good effectively.
You're telling a story that makes sense where you're the hero and you're kind of a good looking hero. Because that's, I don't know. I've been thinking a lot about suffering, and I kind of think a lot of my suffering is that the world is just this big, complex, kind of raga, and I'm trying to shove it into a country song. I'm just trying to make this big chaos make sense. It doesn't make sense. I can't make it that small, so I suffer. And I think with that narcissism is you're trying to feed it into the ego, and you're trying to keep this narrative going where you're kind of the star of the show, but you're not really the star of the show. I mean, there's millions of people, billions of people. You can suffer because of that. But if you're really good at it, you're going to cause other people to suffer more than you're suffering. And that's one of the big problems with narcissism, like addictions, like other things, is that you can make yourself look good by making other people suffer. The same way if you're drunk, you come home and yell at your kids. They suffer, but you're not suffering. So that's one of those, anyway, that's one of those issues with narcissism, is your ego comes at the cost of other people's well-being.
Right. I mean, I think this is an important point. I've seen you kind of elsewhere talking about what makes something a disorder. And, people can be very kind of successful, and, a disorder is, I guess, if it's impairing someone's life. But then there's this interpersonal aspect where someone could be very successful, but their interpersonal relationships, they could be causing a lot of harm, and in my experience of kind of growing up in a narcissistic family, it kind of feels like you're born into someone's game. It feels like you're not really seen as a human. A game is going on that's serving the narcissist's self-image. And then these children come along and it's great. Like, I've got these pawns that I can use. And then, as you say, like if you're kind of aligned with them, then it can go relatively smoothly, but it's still stressful. But if you're not aligned with them, then it's incredibly stressful kind of, Yeah, because I don't think humans are meant to be born into games as opposed to kind of loving, supportive environments.
I mean, when you say it, it's very painful. I want to point out, because this is like powerful, painful stuff. I'm always joking, but I acknowledge that. And the way I've had it described to me once is like, it's like living in a movie set, like an old cowboy Western movie set where you think there's this world, but then, then all of a sudden you get often what happens. I mean, I've seen people have a very good relationship with a narcissistic parent up to the point where the parent, they realize what the parent is because the parent bails on the family, or the parent turns, they see the truth. And it's like all of a sudden they're in a movie set and they didn't know it was a set their whole life. And they looked around, they're like, oh my God, these buildings aren't real. These are sets. This whole thing was a prop. I was a character in this guy's movie. I didn't even know. And your whole life, you're like, holy shit, I was a character in my dad's movie. And now who am I? And that's where it can be really hard for people, because the narcissist is setting up a game for himself or herself to look good and to be the best they can be. And you don't matter.
You also write about kind of managing narcissists in the book. And, I think for a lot of people, there just has to be a kind of a distancing, but there are methods to try to cope with interacting with someone like this. Yeah.
I mean, when you're talking about these kind of childhood things, you're a kid. Kids, I mean, this is, you study attachment theory, anything, and kids survive. I mean, whatever a kid does, kids do what's best for the kid to survive. And then they get out of a toxic environment and get into a healthy environment, and they have to readapt to a place where they're not under threat all the time. But there's nothing wrong with the damn kid. I mean, the kid did what the kid was supposed to do to make it. So the kid did the right thing. They just have to realize that the whole world isn't that bad. So I don't like to, expect anything from children with narcissism, but for an adult, if you're in an enmeshed relationship like that, I'm like, just get the hell out. If it were my kid, I'd just say, get out, it's not worth it. But often we're in situations where we're stuck with people and, at work or, whatever, what do you do? With narcissism, I mean, setting those boundaries, keeping those records, finding allies. So if the person is manipulating you, they're doing it to 20 other people. So you find allies, build up your defense for when that person comes after you. All those things are, smart defensive things to do. The other things that people don't think about as much is you can just manipulate the narcissist back. So you can suck up, you can tell them they're great, you can give them the narcissistic supply they want, and then you become their drug dealer in a way. You're giving them the feedback they want. I got to keep Keith, I'm getting promoted, got to keep Keith around. He keeps me feeling and looking good. So you can do that as well. And I've mentioned this before, and I'm just going to now because is that you can get rid of people by promoting them out. So, you got people you work with who are really narcissistic. You say, you'd be really great at this job in Prague. I think you're perfect for it. And I'm going to help you get that job because you're a winner. So, I mean, you can manipulate people with ego. Because if you're going through life just looking for positive feedback, that makes you a victim. You're just a victim waiting to be taken advantage of by somebody. You're victimizing people, but because you have such strong ego needs, it's very easy for people to manipulate you too, by giving you those ego needs.
Right. And the idea of, as you said, like you can kind of get allies and tactically kind of, take steps to kind of combat it. To someone who's not familiar with this stuff, they may have a reaction of, well, why don't you just talk to them? And I think that's the fundamental difference here, right? And this is why I used the word game before, because it's like, the chilling thing of it is when someone just doesn't seem to be home. You really are up against a game that's just constantly being played. And as you say, the only thing is to either kind of remove yourself from the game or play it back. And it's inherently stressful because it's kind of a competitive, zero sum game.
It's a game. Yeah. The one thing I think is useful just from talking to people who really, struggle with narcissism themselves is that there's one thing to attack people how great they are. So people are like, I'm a 10, and you're like, dude, you're an 8. It's not useful to have that battle with anyone, because all you're doing is telling somebody they're not as great as they think they are. Well, all you're going to do is make them feel bad. But if the problem they have is interpersonal relationships, if it's love, if it's connection, you can say, hey, you're awesome, but you could really connect more. your life would be even more awesome if you could have more love. Your life would be more awesome if you had close relationships. And what people can't get with narcissists, this is something I'm just figuring out, and after talking to people after the book, is that, this is why it's not in the book, but you can't get love. Like, you can be really rich and really powerful and a billionaire, but you can't go buy a loving family. So the dude with a loving family always looks better than you. You can get a fake loving family like a lot of these guys do and have Christmas cards and stuff, but you can't really do that. So people know they're missing something. And so I think sometimes that's what people really want, because they want it. And you're like, look, you can give up a little bit of that ego and get some love. And that's maybe a way to work at the problem more than at the, you're better than everybody part. You're not successful or whatever.
Right. And when this gets extreme, there's also, people talk about malignant narcissism. And I think it seems almost on a continuum that can bleed into psychopathy. Is that a reasonable thing to say?
It's a very reasonable thing to say. The term malignant narcissism is a term that captures narcissism plus really meanness. So if somebody who's narcissistic and is actually going out with some sort of sadistic intent. And psychopathy psychopathy and narcissism are cousins. They share that sort of core, on the big five, they share that low agreeableness, that core antagonism, that core lack of empathy. The difference seems to be that people are psychopathic, don't have as many ego needs, they're more predatory, then sort of they don't need the attention, they don't need the admiration, they don't need the feedback, they just go out and take whatever they want, like predators. There's a lot of the same way I said there's 3 ways we talk about narcissism, there's 3 or 4 ways we talk about psychopathy too, so I'm going to skip that part, but generally they share this core. The difference is, and why narcissism is considered almost sort of less dangerous than psychopathy, is people who are narcissistic want positive social attention. So that's you're like, if you do this, we'll love you, and if you do this, we'll hate you. Well, they'll do what they want it to be loved. But people with psychopaths, that's not as important, so you don't even have that control mechanism. But they're very similar disorders, and some people would say that narcissism is almost a subtype of psychopathy. So, yeah.
And does this relate to the dark triad?
Yeah. I'll step back. Just, you didn't even ask this, but if you look in the clinical manual, the diagnostics, the DSM, psychopathy isn't in there, because we have narcissism and antisocial personality disorder, but they kept psychopathy out because they all correlate, and they had too much of that. The dark triad is a term that came out of personality psychology. A guy named Del Paulus at British Columbia came up with this idea. And the dark triad, the darkness refers to that core low antagonism, or low agreeableness, high antagonism. So that's your core, that's the dark. And the triad are 3 traits. One of those is narcissism, grandiose narcissism. One of those is psychopathy. And the other trait that makes up the dark triad is Machiavellianism. And this is a trait in psychology that really refers to manipulativeness and kind of game playing. It comes from the name, from Machiavelli, from The Prince. So if you read The Prince, and it's really a much better book than people make it sound, but it's the idea of how do you manipulate people to get what you want. So the idea is Machiavellianism is about manipulativeness. They've added another trait, and now they talk about a dark tetrad. And the 4th trait they've added is sadism. And sadism is like that malignant narcissism, but sadism is people who not just are mean, but take pleasure in causing pain. So that's a trait you see a lot with online trolling. So trolls tend to be they're narcissistic, but really sadism is what picks out. And they've done some neat studies on that. So you get these really a host of traits that all share this dark kind of meanness to them, but they manifest it in different ways.
Right. And then there's also this idea of the light triad, right? Which isn't just the opposite of the dark triad.
Yeah, that's my buddy, Scott Barry Kaufman, who's a humanistic psychologist, tried to look at the other side and focused on things like humanism. And he had one that was Kantianism, which I didn't really understand, but sort of more, but the idea was, it wasn't just about not being mean. It was about a more positive approach to the world from a more humanistic perspective. I'd say the opposite side. So you had a light triad. We've talked about a vulnerable dark triad, which has vulnerable narcissism, borderline personality disorder, which is antagonism and neuroticism. So it's the same piece. And then another form of psychopathy, a factor 2 psychopathy. So there are different ways you can kind of parse these up. But really, 5 big buckets work. Just like, I mean, I always think it's like you go to a Mexican restaurant, you got your buckets of food back there, and they can make anything you want out of the 5 big buckets.
Yeah. And so with if you could move a narcissist, into the direction of the light triad, is something like loving kindness meditation something that I think heard you mention that before as something that might help?
Yeah. So if you break it down into where the problems are, and if the problem with narcissism is meanness or lack of compassion, you could think, well, what could I do as an intervention that would increase compassion? And one of those things would be like a loving kindness meditation. I mean, that's a technique, a different kind of techniques to get people to increase compassion through sort of daily practice or daily meditation. I know there's different, I know the Tibetans have, everyone's your mom, kind of these profound processes of expanding your capacity of self. And so I think there are techniques for that. But if your issue is something else, you could work on that other issue. So if the issue is more like, I'm a nice person, but my ego's too big, you could work on that too. You could try to get like accurate feedback about everything you do and take notes, like, oh, I wasn't scoring that well, and get some accountability, in your life. So you figure out what the problem is, and you can kind of address that problem piece by piece instead of taking on the whole thing.
Right. And I think maybe to bring it full circle, I mean, this is kind of touching on what if someone feels like they have narcissistic kind of personality traits, what they might be able to do. Do you have any kind of thoughts on like how one should relate to the ego, like, as a tool for kind of navigating life?
Yeah, I mean, big picture, I'm interested because I don't, I struggle with it because narcissism I see as a real problem. But if you don't have an ego, and if you're not willing to take risks and you're not willing to try things, you're not going to get anywhere. So it's always this balance of like, do you use your ego? But how can you use your ego but not get attached to it? And so for me, I try to think, this is my metaphor. I think of like you use your ego like grabbing a dolphin, in the ocean. It kind of pulls you along and then you let it go when you need to. But that I always have terrible metaphors. I don't know why that's why it sticks to me. But there's got to be a way that people are comfortable with ego, comfortable about it, so they're not fighting it, but also don't become captured by it, that they can say, look, I need my ego here, but it's just a thing. It's not real. I can put it down. I can let it go. I'm much happier without it, but I need it sometimes. And so that figuring out that trade-off, I think, is important. And if you don't have an ego, you're in trouble. But if you get too much of an ego, you're in trouble too. And anyway, I don't know, but I'm concerned that people will be like, I don't have any ego. How are you going to do anything if you're not ambitious enough to do anything? Am I making any sense?
Yeah. No, I think that's where I come down the other day is we're not going to go to one extreme or the other, right? We want a healthy balance of these things. They're there for a reason.
And maybe this goes back to Buddhism again with the middle path. If you're too hung up on your ego, you're just going to end up just causing destruction. But if you don't have enough ego, you're not going to get off the ground. And maybe there's this balance that's really optimal. But the ego is so sneaky. That's the other thing. It's like, you're like, I'm done with my ego. I'm enlightened. And then 2 weeks later, you're like, I'm the best enlightened person. And so ego and spirituality, because it doesn't have really strict rules, is wide open for ego, because who can call you on it? With science, you're like, your test is wrong. You're wrong.
Right.
With spirituality, you're like, no, it's crazy wisdom. You don't understand, but my wisdom of sleeping with everybody in my group is really super wisdom. And you're like, I can't argue with that. So there's this risk in these spiritual communities that they just pull for ego.
Right. Yeah, I think that crazy wisdom thing, if people haven't heard that, I think that's a term that came from Tibetan Buddhism, and it's yeah, been wildly misused to justify, kind of narcissists and psychopaths abusing people. And as far as I'm concerned, as long as there's compassion, like that's the thing that kind of can guide you and not see you far wrong. I personally wouldn't abide a teacher who was teaching me with crazy wisdom.
I don't either, but I started reading the story of Milarepa, the Tibetan saint. And I just been, for whatever reason, really, I just keep reading his little tales. And he's kind of an angry, mean shaman who just murdered a bunch of people, and then he struggled and became a great saint. And so I'm like, people are complicated. You can start but he had a pretty hard row, I think, with the, get rid of his karma. But anyway, I mean, people could come at this stuff in different ways. So I know there's a lot of ways to get there. What I'm worried about, whenever I see anyone who says they're a guru, immediately I'm nervous. And when they got people finding, I'm like, that's always warning signs. Now, I'm sure there are legitimate gurus out there. I'm always dubious of anyone who says they're a guru.
Yeah, that's why I think
shouldn't be, but that's
no, I agree. I think for me, the awareness around narcissism and the way it flourishes in hierarchies, even if that's just a one-tier hierarchy with a student and a guru, to me, this is, if we're going to move our culture forward, I think that would be one of the central pieces. Actually, I would want people having more awareness around and thinking more about whether we can kind of get things more decentralized instead of having these systems where people can really flourish and do harm in that way.
Yeah, it's dangerous. But
this has been great. Yeah. Where would you send people if they want to look into your work more?
Go to wkeithcampbell.com if it's up, or I'm an academic. You can go to Google Scholar and everything's out there. You can find it all if you want, I hope.
Right. And you've got the new Science of Narcissism out now, which I highly recommend, which I listened to on Audible.
Yeah,
the
book is the new Science of, I try to put everything in there from the science in a way that people could understand. I probably overwrote it like everything I do, but hopefully if you're interested in it, it will be useful.
No, yeah. There are sections we didn't even touch on at all. There's a fascinating one on geek culture, which I was not expecting. I'd never thought about the connection between geek culture and narcissism.
Yeah, and I'm going to not talk about it for an hour, but it's any space where people can get status and esteem is going to attract narcissists. Yeah, it's very interesting.
Little ad for the book.
A great student who did all that work.
Yeah. All right. Thanks again, Keith.
Well, thanks, James.